For 10 years, this Mustang stood in the same spot. Then fate intervened. Imagine waiting. Not for a moment, not for a day, not even for a year, but for a decade. Imagine standing in the same place day after day through scorching summers and brutal winters as the world changes around you. The grass grows tall and withers away, the river swells and shrinks with the seasons, and the sky shifts from bright blue to endless storms, yet you remain unmoving. Imagine watching the horizon, hoping that one day the thing you lost would return. But it never does. And still, you stay, not because you cannot leave, but because something deep inside tells you that if you just wait a little longer, if you just hold on for one more day, maybe, just maybe, it will come back to you. For as long as anyone could remember, the Mustang had stood on the ridge. His dark silhouette was a part of the landscape itself, unmoving and eternal. He did not run with a herd, he did not roam the open land. He simply watched. His eyes, sharp and full of something no one could understand, stayed locked on the horizon. Travelers passing through the valley would slow their horses, pausing to stare at the lone stallion. They whispered of him in hushed voices. Some believed he was waiting for something. Others thought he had lost his way, that he had forgotten how to be wild. And there were those who said he wasn't real at all, that he was a ghost, cursed to stand on that ridge forever, watching something no living soul could see. For 10 long years, the Mustang stood on that ridge, silent, motionless, watching the horizon as if waiting for something that would never come. Through scorching summers and bitter winters, through storms that howled across the valley and nights that stretched endlessly beneath the stars, he remained, alone, unmoving, a mystery. The townsfolk had their theories. Some whispered that he had lost his herd and refused to leave the last place he had seen them. Others claimed he was a ghost, bound forever to the land where his story had ended. Travelers slowed their horses as they passed, glancing up at his silhouette against the sky, wondering why a wild stallion born to run, to roam, to chase the wind, had chosen to stay in one place for so long. But no one knew the truth, not until the day Eli Dawson decided to find out. And now, it's time for you to uncover the story. What did Eli discover in the old records buried deep in forgotten archives? What secrets had been hidden beneath the dust of time, waiting for someone to piece them together? Why had the Mustang stayed, year after year, when everything in his nature should have told him to leave? And, most importantly, what happened when the truth was finally revealed? This is more than just a story about a horse. It's a story about loss, patience, and the kind of hope that never fades, no matter how much time passes. It's about how one man's determination to understand the past led to something incredible, something that would change the valley forever. And you won't want to miss it. So if you love powerful stories, if you believe in the strength of hope, if you want to witness a moment that will stay with you long after the video ends, then make sure to subscribe. Click that button, turn on notifications, and join us for more unforgettable stories just like this one. Because some tales are too powerful to be forgotten. And this is one you won't want to miss. Eli Dawson had lived in the valley his entire life. He had been born into its dust and wind, raised beneath its endless sky, and shaped by its wild, untamed beauty. His family owned a modest ranch near the river, where horses roamed in wide paddocks, their hooves kicking up the golden earth. From the time he could walk, Eli had been in the saddle, learning to ride before he could properly run. By the time he was 16, he could break a wild colt, guide a herd across the plains, and read the land like an open book. Briar Creek wasn't much of a town, just a handful of buildings clustered around a dusty road. A general store, a post office, a blacksmith, and a saloon that filled with tired ranchers after long days of work. Life was slow, predictable, and simple. But no matter how much things stayed the same, there was one thing in the valley that never changed. The Mustang. The first time Eli had seen him, he had been just a boy, barely old enough to hold the reins of his father's old mare. They had been riding across the open plains, the valley stretching endlessly before them, golden grasses swaying beneath the wind. And then, Eli had spotted him. A dark figure stood atop the ridge, his silhouette bold and unmoving against the sky. Even at a distance, Eli could see the strength in his frame, his deep chest, powerful legs, and the way the sunlight caught the rippling muscles beneath his sleek coat. His mane was long and wild, tangled by the wind, his tail flicking idly, but his body remained still. The stallion was alone. No herd grazed at his side. No foals danced at his heels. And yet, there was no hesitation in his stance, no fear in his sharp, intelligent eyes. He did not glance at the riders below. He did not flinch at the distant cry of an eagle overhead. He simply watched. His gaze was locked on something unseen, something far beyond the horizon, something only he seemed to understand. Even then, Eli had felt the weight of it. This was no ordinary Mustang. There was a stillness to him, not the kind born from uncertainty, but from purpose. He wasn't lost, yet he did not move. He wasn't weak, yet he did not run. He was simply waiting. Eli had tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing up at the ridge. "Why is he just standing there?" he had asked, his young voice filled with curiosity. His father had followed his gaze, eyes narrowing. He was a man who had spent his whole life working with horses, who could read them the way others read the land. He studied the stallion in silence before shaking his head. "Some horses, they don't run just 'cause they can," he had murmured. "Sometimes they're waiting for something that means more." Eli hadn't understood those words then. But over the years, as he watched the Mustang remain, through scorching summers, through howling winters, through storms that swept the valley, he had come to understand one thing. This Mustang was waiting for something, and he would not leave without it. Years passed, and still the Mustang remained. Seasons changed, reshaping the valley with every turn. Spring painted the hills with bursts of green, rivers swelling from the melted snow. The Mustang stood as the flowers bloomed, his dark coat standing out against the bright earth. Summer followed with blistering heat, the grass turning dry and brittle beneath the relentless sun. Yet the Mustang never sought the shade of the trees below. He remained on the ridge, his figure still and unwavering as waves of heat rippled across the valley. Autumn brought cooler winds, sweeping golden leaves across the plains. Ranchers herded their cattle before the cold set in, watching the stallion from afar, murmuring the same old rumors as they passed. And then came winter. Snow blanketed the land in thick layers, and the wind howled through the valley like a restless spirit. The Mustang stood against the blizzards, ice clinging to his mane, his breath visible in the frozen air. When the storms were at their worst, when not even the toughest ranch horse dared to remain outside, Eli would ride out to the ridge, half expecting to find nothing but emptiness. Yet every time, the Mustang was still there, unmoved, unbroken, unyielding. His legend grew with each passing year. Some cowboys swore they had seen him turn his head, ears pricked at distant hoofbeats that weren't really there. An old trapper claimed he had watched the stallion trot toward the horizon at dusk, only to stop suddenly and return to the same patch of land, as if something had called him back. A group of cattle drivers passing through on their way to Texas slowed their horses when they spotted him, whispering between themselves, shaking their heads. "Ain't natural for a horse to stay like that," one had muttered. "Ain't right," another agreed. Back in town, the stories only grew wilder. Some believed he was waiting for a herd that had long since disappeared, a ghost of a leader who had lost everything and refused to move on. Others said he was cursed, bound to that patch of land for eternity, a spirit in the shape of a horse, watching over the valley like a restless guardian. And then there were those who swore he had once been tamed. A widow who had lived in Briar Ridge all her life swore that, as a young girl, she had seen a boy ride a stallion just like him, a black Mustang with fire in his eyes. She claimed the boy had disappeared one night, lost to the land, and the stallion had been waiting for him ever since. Others dismissed her story, calling it nothing more than an old woman's memories twisted by time, but she never wavered in her belief. Eli, now grown, had heard all these stories, but none of them felt quite right. Because the Mustang wasn't lost. He wasn't waiting for a ghost or clinging to a past that had long since faded. But Eli never believed in curses or ghost stories. Now, at 24, he had seen enough of life to know that every mystery had a truth buried beneath it, and the Mustang's story was no different. Lately, the sight of that lone figure had begun to gnaw at him. The stallion had stood on that ridge for as long as Eli had been alive. Why? What was he waiting for? And why had no one ever tried to find out? The more he thought about it, the more he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Eli couldn't ignore the Mustang's presence any longer. The stallion had stood on that ridge for as long as he could remember, and with each passing year, the weight of his stillness only grew heavier. It wasn't just an oddity anymore. It was a question, one that lodged itself deep in Eli's mind, refusing to let go. What was he waiting for? The thought followed him through his daily life, through the quiet moments when he sat on the porch, watching the horizon, through the restless nights when he stared at the ceiling, wondering. He had grown up with this valley, had seen its rivers shift, its herds move, its people come and go. But the Mustang? He had never left. And Eli wasn't the kind of man who could leave a mystery unsolved. So, he started asking questions. His first stop was the old ranchers, the men who had worked this land long before Eli was born. They were the ones who had watched the valley change over the decades, who had seen horses run wild before fences carved up the plains. Eli rode out to Clint Morgan's ranch first, a sprawling stretch of land at the edge of the valley. The old cowboy was leaning against the fence, chewing on a piece of straw as he watched his cattle graze. "You come out here just to stare at my cows, Dawson, or you got something on your mind?" Clint's voice was rough, worn down by years of dust and wind. Eli hesitated, then got straight to the point. "The Mustang on the ridge. You've ever seen anything like that before?" Clint narrowed his eyes, following Eli's gaze toward the distant hills. He was silent for a long moment before exhaling through his nose. "Ain't natural, is it?" he muttered. "Most horses, they roam, they run. But that one, he's been standing there for too long." Eli leaned forward. "You know why?" Clint tapped his fingers against the wooden rail. "I don't know for sure. But I remember something from back in the day. A long time ago, the government came through here, rounding up wild Mustangs. Claimed they were overpopulated, taking too much land. Whole herds disappeared overnight. Some got sent to sanctuaries, some auctioned off. Wasn't much folks could do about it." Eli's stomach tightened. "And you think?" Clint shrugged. "I think that stallion lost something that day, and he's been waiting ever since." It was a start, but Eli needed more. He rode into town the next day, heading straight for the local archives. The Briar Ridge Gazette had been printing news for over a century, and if something big had happened to the Mustang herds, it would be in there. Inside the small office, dust clung to the air, the scent of old paper and ink filling his lungs. Miss Harriet Clark, the town's historian, barely looked up when he entered. "If you're tracking down old headlines, you best get comfortable," she said, already pointing toward a wall of stacked boxes. Eli rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Hours passed as he flipped through yellowed pages, scanning headlines. Cattle prices rise. Storm damages crops. Local boy wins rodeo. Nothing about Mustangs. Then, just as frustration started creeping in, he found it. Wild Mustang Roundup sparks controversy. Government removes herds from Briar Ridge. The article was dated exactly 10 years ago. Eli's pulse quickened as he read. It detailed how government officials, claiming overpopulation, had corralled and removed entire herds from the valley. The roundup had happened fast, too fast for most people to protest. Horses had been separated, families torn apart. Some were taken to sanctuaries, others sold to new owners across the state. And then, one line stood out. In the chaos, a single stallion escaped capture. Last seen watching the trailers disappear into the distance. Eli sat back in his chair, the weight of the discovery settling over him like a heavy blanket. The Mustang hadn't been abandoned. He had been left behind. Eli didn't know why this hit him so hard. Maybe it was because he knew what it was like to lose something and feel powerless to stop it. Maybe it was because he had always admired the stallion's strength, never realizing it had come from enduring a pain no one had noticed. Or maybe, deep down, he just couldn't stand the thought of a living thing waiting a lifetime for something that might never return. One thing was certain. If the Mustang had lost his family, Eli was going to find them. Then, finally, he found it. 10 years ago, the government had rounded up wild Mustangs in the valley, capturing entire herds. Helicopters had swept low over the plains, driving the horses into pens. Families had been split apart. Stallions had been separated from their mates. Foals had been torn from their mothers. Some had been sent to sanctuaries. Others had been adopted, scattered across the country. And in the chaos, one stallion had been left behind. His mate and young foal had been taken from him. And ever since that day, he had never moved from the spot where he had last seen them. The Mustang hadn't been lost. He had been waiting for his family to return. Eli's chest tightened as he read the last line of the old report. His fingers hovered over the fragile paper. The ink faded, but the meaning sharp, cutting through him like a cold wind. The words blurred for a moment, his pulse loud in his ears. He lifted his gaze toward the window, past the dust-covered shelves and yellowed documents, past the quiet streets of town, and out toward the distant ridge. There, against the vast stretch of sky, the stallion still stood, just as he had for a decade. Eli exhaled slowly, setting the paper down with careful hands as if it held something fragile, something alive. His mind raced, piecing together everything he had learned, everything he had always felt but never understood. The Mustang wasn't just stubborn. He wasn't lost or trapped by fear. He wasn't cursed or bound to that ridge by some ghostly force, as the townsfolk liked to say. He was waiting. For 10 long years, through burning summers and howling winters, through passing storms and shifting seasons, he had held his ground. Not because he couldn't leave, but because somewhere, deep in his soul, he still believed that what was taken from him would come back. A lump formed in Eli's throat. The stallion had been watching the land change, watching the world move forward, watching, always watching, because it was all he had left to do. Eli felt something tighten deep in his chest. A pull, like a thread being drawn taut. How long could someone wait before hope became a burden? He had seen that kind of waiting before. In the old ranchers who still looked toward the horizon, remembering the days when the land was wild and free. In the quiet eyes of men who had sent their sons off to war and never stopped scanning the roads, hoping for a figure to appear in the distance. And now, in the unyielding stance of a lone stallion, standing in the same place where his family had disappeared, Eli swallowed hard. He had always admired the Mustang, had always watched from afar with something close to awe. But now, as he stared toward that ridge, he felt something else. Responsibility, because now he knew the truth. And he couldn't just walk away. The Mustang wasn't waiting for something unseen. He wasn't bound by ghosts or curses. He was waiting for them. And if no one else would bring them back, then Eli would. Determined to uncover the truth, Eli started digging. It wasn't easy. Memories faded fast in a place like this, where people lived by the land and didn't bother keeping records of things they couldn't change. But Eli wasn't one to give up. He started with the oldest ranchers, the men who had worked these lands long before he was born. He sat on weathered porches, drinking black coffee as they talked in slow, thoughtful voices, piecing together what they could remember. Some barely recalled the Mustang roundups at all, but others spoke of it with a weight in their eyes, as if it had been a wound to the land itself. "That was a bad time," one man muttered, running a hand over his grizzled face. Government came in with their helicopters, stirring up dust like a storm, drove the herds hard, too hard. I remember seeing foals running till their legs gave out. Wasn't natural, the way they did it. Eli listened, his gut twisting. He had grown up around horses, knew their ways, their instincts. They were wild creatures, meant to roam free, not be chased into metal pens by the deafening roar of machines. He kept searching, pushing deeper. He checked old newspaper archives, flipping through yellowed pages in the back of the general store where records had been kept for decades. He asked around in neighboring towns, rode miles just to speak with anyone who might remember something useful. The details were scattered, but the more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. 10 years ago, the valley had been full of wild Mustangs, running in strong, proud herds. Then, the roundups began. The government had declared there were too many, that they were damaging the land. Helicopters had swept low over the plains, their blades chopping the air like thunder, sending the Mustangs into a panic. They had been forced into holding pens, their families separated in the chaos. The young ones had been sent to sanctuaries, the strong ones adopted, and many had been taken to ranches far from here. But one stallion had been left behind. Ely found the report buried deep in old records, a brief mention, a forgotten detail. A dark stallion had broken away in the confusion, vanishing before they could catch him. His mate and foal had been taken, and he had disappeared into the hills. The roundups continued, the herds were scattered, and in the end, no one had bothered to go back for him. But he hadn't run. He hadn't moved on. Instead, he had returned to the last place he had seen them. And there, he had stayed. Ely let the paper slip from his fingers, staring at the ridge in the distance. The Mustang wasn't lost. He wasn't waiting for something unknown. He had spent 10 years standing in the same spot because he believed, deep in his wild heart, that they would come back to him. The realization hit Ely hard. The stallion wasn't broken, wasn't cursed, wasn't some ghost bound to the valley. He was a father, a mate, and for a decade he had never given up hope. Ely clenched his jaw, determination settling deep in his bones. If no one else would bring them back, then he would. Eli's search led him across the state, tracing the scattered pieces of a family that had been torn apart a decade ago. It wasn't easy. Records were incomplete, some ranchers had changed hands, and sanctuaries didn't always keep detailed logs of every wild Mustang that passed through their gates. But Ely was patient, determined. He started with the mare. She had been adopted by a small ranching family who raised Mustangs for trail riding. When Ely arrived, he found her grazing in a quiet pasture, her once wild spirits softened by years of domestic life. She was healthy, well-fed, and accustomed to human hands, but there was something in her eyes, a stillness, a quiet longing, as if part of her had never truly settled. Ely approached the fence, watching her carefully. She flicked her ears at him, but didn't shy away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder, his thumb hovering over the button. It was a long shot, but if the Mustang had waited 10 years, maybe, just maybe she had too. He pressed play. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, resonant call that had echoed over the valley for years, carried by the wind and lost to time. The Mustang's call. The mare's head snapped up. Her ears pricked forward, her body tensed, and then, slowly, recognition flashed in her eyes. She took a hesitant step toward the fence, nostrils flaring, as if she could smell the past in the air. Ely exhaled, feeling the first flicker of hope. But there was still one more to find. The foal, now a grown stallion, was harder to reach. He had been taken to a sanctuary far from the valley, raised in wide enclosures with other rescued Mustangs. Unlike his mother, he had never known the comfort of human hands, never felt the warmth of a familiar herd. He was strong, untamed, a force of nature in his own right. When Ely found him, the young stallion was standing at the far end of the pasture, staring toward the horizon, waiting. He had never known his father, never heard his voice, but something inside him still called him home. It took time to arrange the transport. Sanctuaries were protective of their Mustangs, and Ely had to prove that what he was doing was right, not for himself, but for them. When he finally secured the trailer and loaded both horses inside, he couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest. Would the Mustangs still be there? Would he even recognize them after so many years? Ely drove through the night, the familiar roads of the valley stretching out before him. The ridge stood in the distance, unchanged, timeless. And on that ridge, like a shadow against the sky, the Mustang stood, waiting. Eli pulled the truck to a stop. Dust settled around the trailer as he climbed out, heart hammering in his chest. He moved to the back, gripping the latch, and pulled the doors open. The mare was the first to step out. She hesitated, hooves sinking into the dry earth. The wind shifted, carrying familiar scents, old memories, and then she lifted her head and let out a soft, trembling call. The Mustang froze. For the first time in 10 years, his muscles tensed. His ears flicked forward, his head lifted. The wind held its breath. And then he moved. Step by step, he descended the ridge, his dark eyes locked onto the mare. He approached slowly, carefully, as if not daring to believe it. The years had changed them both, but some things were eternal. The young stallion remained behind, muscles taut, watching, unsure. He had never met this Mustang, never run at his side. But then, his father called. A deep, commanding cry rang through the valley, carrying across the land like a long-lost song, one that had been waiting 10 years to be sung. It was raw and powerful, echoing off the hills, wrapping around the wind, demanding to be heard. It wasn't just a call, it was recognition, it was belonging, it was home. The young stallion stiffened, his ears flicking toward the sound. His nostrils flared as he took in the scent that drifted toward him, something familiar, something buried deep in his bones, though he had never known why. His muscles twitched, hesitation flickering in his dark eyes. He had never met this stallion before. He had never stood beside him, never run at his side. And yet, something inside him stirred, something instinctual, something undeniable. The mare had already taken slow, careful steps forward. Her breath came in short, quiet huffs, her body tense as she searched the face of the Mustang she had once known. Could he still be the same? Would he remember? The Mustang stood still as stone, but his entire body pulsed with energy. His ears pointed forward, his dark eyes locked onto her, taking in every detail, the way her mane caught the wind, the faint, familiar markings along her coat, the way her stance, cautious but yearning, mirrored his own. And then she called to him. It was soft, hesitant, but filled with something deep and unshakable, a sound only meant for him. The Mustang moved. Not a rush, not a frantic charge, but a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. His breath was steady, his body filled with both hesitation and certainty, as if he couldn't believe she was real, but knew she had never been anything else. Step by step, he closed the distance. His eyes never left hers, searching for the truth in them, searching for the years lost between them. The wind carried the scent of her, and it struck him like a memory pulled from the depths of time. The young stallion remained behind, his legs stiff, his heart pounding. He could feel it, a pull that reached beyond understanding, beyond logic, beyond time itself. A pull stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. The Mustang turned toward him. His stare was piercing, unreadable, full of something the young stallion had never known but somehow recognized all the same. And then he called again. A deep, commanding cry that sent a shiver through the valley. It was not just a call. It was a declaration. The young stallion shuddered, his body coiled with energy. The hesitation, the uncertainty, it all vanished in an instant. And then, with a burst of motion, he ran. The earth trembled beneath his hooves. His breath came in sharp, powerful bursts as his legs stretched, muscles surging with newfound purpose. The wind roared past his ears. Every stride closed the space between them, until the dust between them was no more. The Mustang pressed his head to the mare's, breathing her in, grounding himself in the moment that had taken a decade to arrive. A decade of waiting, of loss, of standing on that ridge, believing he would never see his family again. And then he turned to his son. He nudged him, firm, strong, unquestioning. A touch that said everything words never could. "You are mine." And then, without hesitation, he turned toward the open valley and ran. His family followed. The Mustang had waited 10 years. But now, at last, they were whole again. Eli stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest as he watched the reunion unfold before him. The stallion pressed his muzzle against the mare's neck, breathing her in, his body trembling with something too deep to name. The younger horse stood a few steps behind, uncertain, until his father's call reached him, low, commanding, filled with something powerful and unshaken by time. And then, just like that, the waiting was over. Eli's hands curled at his sides, his fingers digging into the fabric of his worn shirt. This was it. The moment he had imagined 100 times since uncovering the truth. But standing here, watching it happen, it hit him harder than he expected. For so long, the Mustang had been a mystery, an unspoken question that hung over the valley, lingering like an unfinished story. But now, as dust swirled around the reunited family, that story had found its ending. Eli exhaled, his chest tight, his heart beat steady but heavy. He had seen many things in his life: storms breaking over the plains, the birth of a foal in the early hours of dawn, the way the land always found a way to heal itself, but nothing compared to this. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a promise fulfilled. He thought about the years the Mustang had stood alone, the silent suffering, the patience, the quiet strength it took to believe, to trust that, even after everything, his family would return to him. And now, they had. Eli exhaled, his breath shaky, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe? Or something deeper? Something that had been building from the moment he first laid eyes on that lone stallion as a boy. The Mustang stood tall, his dark coat catching the last golden light of the sun. But this time, he was not alone. The mare stood beside him, her body pressed close in silent reassurance. The young stallion lingered just behind, shifting uncertainly before nudging his father's shoulder, a small, almost hesitant motion. The Mustang responded instantly, turning toward him, brushing his muzzle against his son's in a quiet, unshakable gesture. "You belong. You are home." Eli swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the worn leather of his gloves. He had done what he set out to do. He had given back what had been stolen. And yet, as he watched the three stand together at last, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been given something too. Then, as if pulled by some unseen thread, the Mustang turned, not toward the horizon, not toward the open valley stretched before him, but toward Eli. Eli's breath caught. The stallion took a slow step forward. The mare followed, her ears flicking in quiet curiosity. The young stallion hesitated, casting a quick glance at his father before stepping forward as well. They were coming to him. Eli held still, his heart hammering. He had spent months searching, chasing every lead, following every whisper, believing that all of this was for the Mustang. And it was. But now, standing at the edge of the ridge, watching as the very family he had reunited made their way toward him, he realized something else. They knew. The Mustang stopped just feet away, close enough that Eli could see every line of muscle beneath his dark coat, the scars of a life lived through hardship, the strength of a creature who had refused to give up. The stallion lowered his head. Eli let out a slow breath, his fingers twitching at his sides, but he didn't move, didn't speak. He only watched as the Mustang exhaled, a deep, steady breath, almost like a sigh, a release. Then, as if making a decision of his own, the stallion closed the final gap between them. Eli felt the warmth of his breath before he felt the gentle press of the stallion's forehead against his chest. A thank you. Eli's throat burned, his hands hovering in the space between them. Slowly, he let his fingers brush against the Mustang's neck, feeling the warmth of his coat, the life beneath it. Real, whole, free. The mare stepped closer, tilting her head in quiet acknowledgement. The young stallion, unsure but drawn by the moment, followed, his large eyes blinking as he studied the man who had changed everything. Eli swallowed, his voice lost somewhere deep inside him. What could he even say? That it had been worth it? That every long mile, every late night spent searching, every moment of doubt had all led to this? That he had started this journey thinking he was helping them, only to realize that somehow they had helped him too? But the Mustang already knew. Eli stepped back, giving them space, knowing they were not his to keep. The Mustang lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto Eli's one last time. A final goodbye, or maybe something even more lasting, a quiet promise. Then, as the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the hills, the Mustang turned. And this time, when he ran, he was not alone. Eli stood by the open trailer, dust swirling around him, the echoes of pounding hooves fading into the distance. His hands rested on the weathered wood of the fence, but his grip loosened as he exhaled, watching the last glimpses of dark silhouettes melt into the golden horizon. The Mustang would never stand still again. His wait was over. For 10 years, the stallion had held his ground, through scorching summers and bitter winters, through storms that battered the valley and nights where only the wind answered his silent calls. He had refused to move, refused to forget, clinging to the hope that what was taken from him would return. And now, after a decade of waiting, he no longer had to. Eli watched as the three figures crested the distant hills, their manes catching the light of the setting sun, running in perfect rhythm. The Mustang led them, strong and sure, his hooves striking the earth with purpose. The mare stayed close, as if afraid to let him out of her sight again, and the young stallion, no longer uncertain, thundered beside them, his wild spirit awakening at last. They would roam together now, as they were always meant to. As a family. Eli felt something tighten in his chest. It was rare to see justice in the world, rare to set something right that had been wrong for so long. But as the last traces of the Mustangs vanished into the vastness of the land, he knew one thing for certain. The ridge would be empty now. No more waiting, no more stillness. For 10 long years, the Mustang had stood as a monument to loss, a reminder of what had been taken. But now, at last, he was free. Eli stood watching long after the dust had settled, long after the Mustang and his family had disappeared into the hills, their figures swallowed by the endless horizon. The wind swept across the valley, whispering through the tall grass, carrying with it the weight of a decade spent in quiet, unwavering hope. And in that moment, Eli understood something. This wasn't just a story about a horse that had waited. This was a story about faith, the kind that doesn't break under time, the kind that withstands loss and loneliness, the kind that refuses to fade even when the world says it should. The Mustang had not simply stood still, he had endured, he had believed. Even when others saw nothing but an unmoving silhouette on a ridge, even when they called him cursed or lost, he had held on to something no one else could see. And isn't that what hope is? The world is full of things that try to break us. Time, grief, uncertainty. They push and pull, testing how much we can take. They whisper that it's easier to let go, that it's foolish to keep believing in something that may never come. But the Mustang never listened. Because sometimes, hope is all you have. And then there was Eli, the boy who grew up watching the stallion, who felt the pull of a mystery others ignored. He could have let it go, could have dismissed the Mustang's stillness as nothing more than habit. But he didn't, because something inside him knew that when something doesn't make sense, it's worth looking closer. Knew that when a story feels unfinished, it's worth chasing the truth. Knew that when someone is waiting, sometimes they just need someone willing to bring them home. How many times do we walk past something that doesn't seem right? How often do we let the weight of the past settle, assuming there's nothing we can do to change it? Eli could have turned away, but instead he followed the trail of history, pieced together the past, and did something most wouldn't have bothered to do. He didn't have to fix what had happened. He didn't have to erase the 10 years of waiting. He just had to care. And the community, what about them? They had seen the Mustang for a decade. They had told stories about him, passed rumors and legends down like old cowboy tales. But they never asked, why? They saw what was in front of them, but they never looked beyond it. How many times do we do the same? How many times do we look at someone's struggle and assume we know the answer? How often do we dismiss someone's silence, someone's stillness, without ever wondering what it is they're holding on to? The truth had been there all along. The stallion wasn't a ghost. He wasn't lost. He wasn't waiting for something that would never come. He was waiting for what was rightfully his. And in the end, the lesson is simple. Patience is not weakness. Hope is not foolishness. And the past is never beyond repair. It took 10 years for the Mustang's family to return. It took 10 years for someone to see him, not just as a lonely figure against the sky, but as something more. It took 10 years for the story to find its ending. But it did. And in the end, the Mustang did not run alone. Because the things we wait for, the things we truly believe in, have a way of finding their way back. This story is a reminder that patience, hope, and unwavering belief can lead to something extraordinary. Some things are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes. And when the moment finally comes, it's more powerful than we ever imagined. If this story moved you, if you love tales of resilience, determination, and the unbreakable bonds that time cannot erase, then make sure to subscribe. We bring you stories that inspire, that remind us of what truly matters, that leave you thinking long after the video ends. Don't miss out on more incredible journeys like this one. So click that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be part of a community that loves powerful storytelling. Because some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.